it's a real pleasure to welcome Dr. Luke Powell back to Tufts. And I say back to Tufts because he graduated from Tufts 19 years ago. He was double majored in biology and environmental studies. After leaving Tufts, Luke went to the University of Maine to get a master's degree where he started immersing himself in birds, and he's been with birds ever since, which those of you who know me know I approve of that. Luke got his PhD in 2013 from Louisiana State University, where he worked on the effect of land use history on movement and dispersal on Amazonian birds. And since then, Dr. Powell has continued research in both the Amazon and the African tropics, particularly in Equatorial Guinea. He's currently got at least 2 affiliations that I know of. He was the founding director, or is the founding director of the Biodiversity Initiative in Washington, D.C., which is an international conservation NGO that focuses on ecology and conservation in Africa. And starting this past year, he started as a researcher at the University of Porto in Portugal with their tropical biology program. Dr. Powell publishes a lot in scientific literature, and he also is involved in a lot of on-the-ground training in Africa and field methods in conservation. And he's here today to talk to us about birds, bees, and African chocolate trees. Take it away, Luke.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reed. I really appreciate the invitation and the opportunity to talk to Tufts students. As you mentioned, I was a student at Tufts 19 years ago, I guess, which is kind of hard to believe. And it's nice to have the opportunity for some kind of a trickle-down influence. And so I've listed many of my co-authors here on this page. And really, Biodiversity Initiative is I would say it's a research co-op. So a research and conservation co-op. So together we produce a ton of information on sub-Saharan Africa and how conservation and ecology affects the systems there. And so these are the authors that I happen to have listed just now, but I probably could add another 10 or 20 people. So it's really a team effort. So with that, I'll get things started. So I guess first I'd like to thank the small army of funders and field technicians and collaborators that have helped me throughout this process. Mayor Curie Fellowship in particular, Durham University, Glasgow University, the Waterloo Foundation, Carnegie Fellowship, and my current granting institution is part of the EU's Horizon 2020. That's the CIBIO program that does research and conservation in sub-Saharan Africa, primarily the Portuguese-speaking countries. But today I'm going to be talking mostly about Cameroon and Equatorial Guinea. But first, a little foray. I did the best I could to look on my hard drive to find photos of myself from Tufts, and I found these 2 photos and these 2 photos only, however goofy they are. And I think it's actually, I'm like 22 years old there, something like that, 21. And I think it's telling that both of the photos, I'm actually in the field. So I think that speaks to the influence of Tufts for me as a field biologist and ecologist. This is a marine field course there. I'm looking at, looks like I'm in the intertidal zone. I remember nothing of this, picture on the left. On the right, I'm at George Elmore's trip to Hummingbird Cay in the Bahamas. So that was an important trip for me to realize that I love to immerse myself in the tropics, tropical research. And I was really influenced by Dr. Elmore, Dr. Reed, Dr. Dane, who's since retired, and Dr. Orion. So many thanks to all of them for shaping me as a young biologist. So getting out of Tufts, I basically took as many field jobs as I could because I knew that the tropics were really important to me personally and that they were a real hotspot for environmental conservation work. And they were, where the action was in terms of biodiversity and birds and animals. This is from Peru. In around 2015, I spent a bunch of time immersed in tropical rainforests in the southeast part of the country, the Western Amazon, studied macaws and clay licks and had all kinds of cool responsibilities as an intern. And I was totally hooked and on being a tropical biologist at this point. And as Dr. Reed mentioned, I did my PhD at LSU. I immersed myself in the central Amazon, and I knew that I wanted to work at tropical rainforests. At some point, late in my PhD and early on after that, myself and a bunch of colleagues that I had worked with, we basically founded Biodiversity Initiative, BI, because of the obvious need for research and capacity building in sub-Saharan Africa. It was clear to us that the Brazilians in particular really, in the previous generation, really built up their capacity to be the stewards for their own biodiversity and their own sort of natural history and natural world. There's amazing universities and research and NGOs in Brazil that are working super hard to protect the Amazon, but no such infrastructure exists in Africa. So we're basically doing the best that we can to work with Africans and advance that world. So I'll start quite broad here with this egregious photo of an African emerald cuckoo, and I'm just going to sprinkle in amazing bird and wildlife pictures throughout and try not to get distracted by them myself. I'll do the best that I can, but no promises. So this is starting broad here. This is the map of species richness on Earth. And you can see, if you can see my cursor, that things are really, just a second, I'm adjusting zoom. Things are really concentrated here in the tropics, just here, with this red color that's the most diverse areas. And this is a map of the remaining tropical rainforests of the world. And what you're seeing here is a map from Manga Bay that approximates what's left. You can see there's big chunks missing from West Africa, but the two biggest rainforests in the world, Central Africa, most of the Congo Basin and the Amazon, are still really intact. Then you can overlay these and you get the intersection of the two, which will really tell you that the biodiversity is very much focused in tropical rainforest, and that's what I'm interested in. So why study tropical rainforests? They contain more than half of the Earth's biodiversity on just 7% of the land surface, as E.O. Wilson, who recently passed, has professed. And we've already lost half of this. So this is incredible urgency for us to do something about this and to mitigate the issue immediately. And so although there have been some recent advances, this ebbs and flows with sort of political appointments as well as fires and whatnot, but there's still around 7 million hectares of tropical rainforest loss annually. Hectare is roughly the size of a football field, 100 meters by 100 meters. And so we're still losing like 1 football field per second, just as I've been talking, it's depressing to think about how much has been lost. And that's like the size of Oklahoma or Ireland every single year. So it's a super urgent contemporary issue. Now, I have to talk about human population change and growth. The good news is human population is going to stabilize this century as they project. And before I started working in Africa, what I thought of when I thought of human population growth was India and China, right? And that's what the media will have you believe. But actually, if you look at the numbers, and I've gotten ahead of myself, the human population of Africa is going to quadruple this century. There will be 4 times as many Africans, right? And that will put enormous pressure on natural resources there. That's in addition to the enormous pressure that the developed world, i.e. us, is already putting on Africa through our desire for coffee and chocolate and oil palm and cashews and all the other things that are grown primarily in Africa. So I would also be missing out without mentioning that probably the biggest thing that drives human population growth is women's education. And it's the point where we can make the largest positive impact, not only in women's lives, but also when women are more educated, they have children later and they have fewer children. And this means that the human population growth stabilizes and is basically good for everything. And this is one of our students holding a sunbird from one of our workshops in Equatorial Guinea. And these lovely photos I should mention are taken by Tristan Spinsky, who's done work for Audubon and New York Times, and he's just wonderful. Check out his website. And so I love this this graph here with the change in distribution of human population, right? So on the left, this is a current population of all these countries, and on the right is what it's going to be at the end of the century. And so by 2100, Africa will have 6 of the 11 most populous countries on Earth. 6 of them. So most at the huge chunks of the Earth's human population will be in Africa. Nigeria is going to be bigger than China. The DRC is going to increase enormously by 5 or 6 times. Angola is going to be bigger than Brazil. Angola is currently the 44th biggest country in the world. It's going to move all the way up to number 11. So this is going to put huge pressure on natural resources in Africa, worth repeating. So Africa is the place to be. In recent years, my interest has become understory birds, although my interests are pretty diverse. This is one of the things I've been sort of focused on to keep my fingers on the pulse. This is a lovely Western bluebill. It's in the Astrilidae family. It's basically a type of African finch with this impossibly huge and pearly blue colored bill for cracking giant seeds on the rainforest floor. So why study tropical birds? As I learned during my PhD work in the Amazon, insectivorous tropical birds are among the first to disappear, decline when the forest is degraded. And then when the forest comes back, if it comes back, they're among the last to return. So they're really nice indicators of ecosystem health in tropical rainforests. And so this is a really recent publication in Ecology Letters from the team with which I did my PhD, Phil Stouffer at LSU. And I want you to focus on these 2 bars here in red. Basically what we're looking at is a 40+ year data set from the central Amazon, undisturbed primary rainforest that's never been cut. And these 2 ecological guilds, the insectivorous birds, like this wing-banded antbird that walk around or sort of hop around in the understory, are the ones that are most affected. They're the guilds that are strongly and significantly declining, even in primo rainforest, probably caused by climate change and structure to the forest, but we're not really sure. So at least in the Amazon, we're pretty sure that these are the lovely indicator guilds and are rainforest specialists, primary rainforest specialists. And generally the pattern is when there's anthropogenic disturbance, you lose these specialists, and instead you get left with the rats, the pigeons, and the cockroaches of the world, the generalists. And despite being a native New Yorker, I am not particularly keen to have a world with just these generalist species. And so the interesting thing is that these understory birds have evolved a kind of form of convergent evolution, where I showed you this wing-banded antbird here from Manaus, Brazil, but this log runner is from Australia, and this ground thrush is from our study plots in Equatorial Guinea, and they're in totally different families, independently evolved. So although we really know pretty well from the Amazon which of the ecological guilds, these understory birds, are sensitive, because Africa is so poorly studied, we don't understand these patterns really at all. So we were looking really to fill a lot of these gaps in our understanding with our research, and see if this pattern holds pantropically, across different tropical regions, especially these 2 biggest chunks of rainforest that remain on Earth. And so I love this picture. There's no coincidence that there's a bird here that is the literal canary in the coal mine, right? This is the bird that miners would take with them, because when it died, or when it got sick, it was an indication that something is really, really wrong and you need to get the hell out of there. It's the indicator species, and because birds are fantastic indicators of ecosystem health, of environmental conditions. And perhaps there's some irony here that the canary is actually an African species. So here is basically my study area, West and Central Africa here. You can see the chunks of rainforest that remain in more detail. The central Amazon, this is called the Lower Guinea forest, is still largely intact. But West Africa, this light green, has mostly been deforested already. That's mostly driven by the developed world, and growing of commodity crops such as oil palm and cacao or cocoa. I'll use those interchangeably for chocolate, coffee, etc. But in Central Africa, there's still huge opportunity to do the work and to conserve the big blocks of rainforests that are there. But we have to be careful because there's the climate predictions are showing that Central Africa is going to be sort of increasingly suitable for a lot of those commodity crops. So it's really a conservation frontier. As you can see in the Eastern DRC, there's a ton of deforestation, and cocoa is certainly moving into that area. I should sort of point out here, this is Cameroon. The southern half is fully tropical rainforest, lots of intact habitat. And this is Equatorial Guinea, which includes Bioko Island, where the current capital is Annobon, and mainland Equatorial Guinea is kind of this rectangle about the size of Massachusetts. And there it is. So here the dark green is really high quality forest, and the light green is sort of medium quality, but I would say primary. The yellow is currently protected areas. And I'm just going to zoom in here on this area here, which is the location of the new capital city that they are installing. They have cut from primary rainforest and are currently building a la Brasilia in the 1960s. So we got in here almost 10 years ago now and started collecting data and setting up a research site. This is just a zoom in of it. This sort of yellowish color is primary rainforest. This is the city grid that's been cut. And this is our 100-hectare plot in primary forest, a 100-hectare plot in sort of secondary or selectively logged forest, if you will. And this is a new university that just opened. So this would represent the only university in the world that is within walking distance of primary rainforest. So it's a really cool, cool study location. And I could not resist sharing this really awesome potential that we have and are currently developing. So this pink spot here is the proposed Reserva de la Paz. So that is a 110,000 hectare proposed reserve that we're working on with this organization called Rainforest Trust that provides money for new reserves. And we are really confident that we're going to get the money, but I don't want to, the champagne is on ice, but it's not popped yet. So in June, we'll get word from the Board of Rainforest Trust on whether they're going to fund it. But this is an enormous opportunity because it's mostly fully intact rainforest system. It's connected to 2 already existing reserves, has the full complement of African fauna, and 110,000 hectares is like 5 times the size of Boston. It's twice as big as like the whole New York City, even including Staten Island. And so it's a big place, you know, big enough to support populations of really incredible animals into the future. So I'm super excited about this, not just because it's protecting our study sites, but also because it's a wonderful opportunity for Equatorial Guinea to, you know, conserve their natural heritage. And just some egregious camera trap photos here that we've taken in and around the reserve. This is a giant pangolin, which you should Google, is out of this world and is now endangered, or probably should be critical and endangered. The giant pangolin one that looks like an armored Volkswagen Beetle with a giant club tail. This is forest elephant. They're common on the landscape and they're endangered, of course, persecuted widely for their tusks. This is our closest living relative, which you might recognize, that with which we share 99% of our DNA. I actually set up this particular camera trap with my colleague Jared Wolf, and we were really psyched to get this picture, which is like 200 yards from that university. And finally, Mr. Silverback, critically endangered Western lowland gorilla. So tons of really awesome fauna in and around this site. So that was my sort of mammal tease. There'll be a little bit of bat work later that I'll share, but I couldn't resist sharing those photos. Now, I should describe a little bit, go back just one slide, so you can see basically what the forest looks like. This is primary forest. This one here is secondary forest. And when I say secondary forest, I mean sort of lightly selectively logged at this particular site. It works out advantageously in terms of conservation, that in Africa, as opposed to say Southeast Asia, there's not a ton of super valuable trees for timber production. So they tend to be logged on the lighter side. But our plots are both closed canopy forests, and to the naked eye, the untrained eye, it would be really actually quite difficult to tell the difference. But the animals can tell. The birds can absolutely tell the difference. So this is called an ordination plot, and each one of these dots is a different bird species. And the ellipses basically just represent how the bird species separate in sort of ecological space. And so you can see there's a pretty clean separation between the birds found in secondary forest and birds in primary forest, really indicating that there is a real difference in something about the forest, probably the structure or the food resources that are there, and that makes a difference to the birds. So we're probably losing some of those forest specialists. So a little bit more detail on that. This is just a sort of species specific look. These are what I call the canaries. And actually, they're sort of like thrush-like species that hop or walk around on the forest floor. This is the lowland accolade, which is sort of like a European robin. It walks and hops around in the low understory. This is also a sort of near-ground insectivore in Elodopsis, another secretive rainforest specialist. And these two species, these two elites here on the left and right, are really specialized in that they follow swarms of ants. This is a sort of unique strategy that's used, and it makes them particularly vulnerable. And all four of these species are the indicators in which they're found much less in secondary forests, these blue dots, than they are in primary forests, the red dots. And just a little dive into natural history here. These are Darless driver ants that they follow around. The ecological equivalent in the Amazon are called army ants. They're totally unrelated system, but independently evolved. Another convergent evolution example, which I sort of my pet like. And this is a really fascinating and somewhat horrifying system where imagine the size of like half of a tennis court. So if you come into a swarm of one of these driver ants, if you step in that area the size of roughly half a tennis court, you would step on like 300 ants. And they would attack the hell out of you, and it's horrible. And anybody who's worked around these ants has had this experience, and really the only defense against that is to like sort of strip down, take all your clothes off, and kindly ask your colleague to pick the ants off you. Otherwise, it's just torture. And not that this has ever happened to me. So this is important not only for self-preservation, but also for the birds, because what the birds do is they specialize on going to the edge of these raiding army ants, and excuse me, driver ants in the African case, and they will sort of pick off the insects that are fleeing in terror from these ants. And we're nearly certain that the ants are keystone species because they're like fundamentally changing the composition of the rainforest, and that they have enormous trickle-down effects on the whole community. I mean, every like square meter of the forest floor is being covered by these ants. I mean, literally covered, like once a week or twice a week. So anybody that has told you that the lion is the king of the jungle has no idea what they're talking about. In fact, it is a queen, and it is most certainly an ant. Okay, now sort of make the transition to cacao or cocoa, which is the crop that, of course, we all consume very regularly, and chocolate, myself included. And this is, I mentioned secondary forest as being a human modified habitat. And this is another super common one in Africa, one of the most. It's native to the sort of Latin America, but it's grown natively in the understory, under the shade. So this is advantageous because it presents the potential to have a win-win situation where farmers are producing lots of crop, and also there's a lot of biodiversity because you're basically simulating a rainforest with an intact canopy. About 75% of the cocoa in the world is grown in Africa, although it's really, really poorly studied, especially compared with, say, Indonesia or the neotropics. There's great need for research there. Why cacao? Before we started working there were 0 published studies focused on wildlife biodiversity and cacao in Africa, which I still cannot believe, even though I've probably read this 10 times now. We have changed this. Based on the little bit of data that existed, we knew that traditional farms, which are shady, could retain about 95% of the bird species of primary rainforest. So we thought, okay, here's a habitat that has great potential, unlike, say, oil palm that has to be grown in the sun, and it's a really strict monoculture where it's pretty much just oil palm, really bad for wildlife. The pollinator of cacao is totally unknown. So that's despite like 70 years of research. It's a tiny little flower and tiny little insects that presumably pollinate it. So there was opportunity there based on some of the techniques that we used. I'll get into that. And the overwhelming majority of who consumes chocolate is in the developed world, Europe and the US. So I would argue that we're the ones that are creating this issue. And it's also our responsibility to mitigate the issue rather than just wiping our hands, putting the blinders on and saying, you deal with it. That is completely unethical. We need to take a responsibility for the actions that are creating vast changes in the rest of the world. And in terms of the drivers of deforestation of tropical Africa, this is a little bit of an old graph, but it still very largely holds. It's mostly agriculture, small scale agriculture, shifting agriculture, and cocoa is no exception. It's mostly 2-3 hectares, small scale farmers. So addressing this issue directly is also very directly addressing deforestation. Now, we wanted to know, one of the first questions we wanted to ask is whether cacao or cocoa is good bird habitat. Is it any good? Are those preliminary studies, can we corroborate them? So this is part of my PhD student, Corinne and Jarrett's work. We worked in about 200 sites across Cameroon and Equatorial Guinea, caught about 1,500 birds over many years. This basically is just a chart looking at diversity, gamma diversity, and you can see that actually cocoa is higher. So by some measures, cocoa is actually more diverse in bird species than in forest. But what you lose, diversity is a complicated thing. What you lose is these forest specialists. So we wanted to get into more detail on that. So we had kind of 3 habitats here, full sun cocoa, which basically looks like that, cocoa monoculture. A shade cocoa, which is grown under a canopy of mostly native trees, at least in Cameroon where I work. In the Ivory Coast and Ghana, it's a totally different situation with mostly full sun cocoa, which has largely resulted in the ecosystem collapse in these countries and total even shade of the change of the climate, lack of rainfall, etc. And then the third habitat is primary rainforest, which looks like this. And so what we did is we broke the different rainforest birds down into various different ecological guilds: ant followers, forest specialists, frugivores, insectivores, mixed species flockers. That's another super interesting natural history story that I'll resist the urge to tap on, but suffice to say that dozens of species form these mixed groups that roam around the Amazon until they meet their another sort of mixed flock group, and then they pair up and sort of squabble species by species like sort of superheroes and their arch rival villains or something like this. Anyway, so what we see, basically these bars represent the abundance of each one of these guilds. And what we see, if we focus here in red on this circle, is that in the full sun cocoa, you're looking at ant followers and the forest specialists. There's basically none. Shade cocoa, there's a little bit, much more than in full sun cocoa, so it's better. But in primary forest, there's roughly 10 times the amount of ant following birds and insectivorous rainforest specialists. So turns out cocoa is quite diverse. It is a nice habitat. for a lot of the bird community, but it's not a substitute for primary rainforest. You absolutely need primary rainforest to ensure the integrity of the ecological community and the functional diversity of it as well. And so these same canaries exist in this system as well, right? So we had almost no captures of any of these 4 canaries, the near ground insectivores and the ant falling species in any cocoa. A little bit in the shadiest cocoa that was right on the edge of forest reserve, but still hardly any. So these are the good ecological indicators. And now, so building up from simply community composition, we wanted to know a little bit about ecosystem services. So ecosystem services are basically what nature provides for people for free. So quantifying this, and I think to me, sort of, to some people can sort of cheapen it in that you're putting a dollar sign onto nature, but it also, you know, the people who make decisions, politicians and land managers and so forth, they respond to dollar signs. So if you say, you know, this bird is this bird is saving farmers, you know, hundreds of millions of dollars annually through eating pests, that is going to get their attention. So I think this is an important thing to quantify. So ecosystem services include improving the soil, eating pests, which I mentioned. Bats provide a ton of ecosystem services as well, pollination, and the list goes on and on. So this is a family of Cameroonians during the cocoa harvest season. This is a Samba Christian and his family. And you can see that they're totally embedded in the cocoa ecosystem, right? I mean, they're eating the cocoa, which, by the way, is delicious, just like the meat of this white flesh that it has, super sweet, and it's amazing. And this is important because for a Samba, a sustainable system in which the cocoa trees last a long time and they steadily produce, and that they don't have to be a ton of chemical inputs. This is really important. In a full sun cocoa system, like is frequently used in the Ivory Coast and Ghana, there's a ton of pesticides, there's a ton of fertilizer, there's fungicides, there's herbicides, and these are often carcinogenic, and there's very little money for personal protective equipment. So it's absolutely not advantageous for a Samba and for farmers like him. So what we're looking for is a sustainable solution in which nature provides those services, and that a Samba and the farmers will have a steady income. So a win-win for nature and for farmers. So just to touch on cocoa pollination and what we've done there, this is a close-up of a cocoa flower. This is more like life size. You can see a little pinky nail, so they're absolutely tiny. And what an insect has to do to pollinate is get inside of that reproductive part and move the pollen around. So the idea that my graduate student Almalis has been working on is she's using a technique called DNA metabarcoding. The idea that you probably heard of DNA barcoding, where you can sequence a bit of DNA and tell what species it is. Metabarcoding is taking a little bit of a sample and then asking what are basically all of the species found in it. It's metabarcoding, but many different species at once. So you can do that with these cocoa flowers. So Amalis will basically tear the flower apart and get that little bit of the reproductive part, which has closed the little tiny traces of DNA that's left inside. And so she sequences that, and that will tell you basically who the pollinators are, the visitors to the inside of the flower, the reproductive parts. And she's found, after like 70 years of flailing around with cocoa research on the pollinator, that gall midges, biting midges, and parasitoid wasps appear to be, at least in this preliminary work, the main pollinators of cocoa. So this is a big advance, and it allows us to take advantage of this really cool new technique, this DNA metabarcoding, to answer a cool sort of ecological question. Then the idea would be, then you can manage the habitat. So for example, leave chunks of rainforest, leave habitat at a small scale for these animals to exist and to breed. And then we wanted to ask probably one of our main questions here in cocoa in Cameroon is, do birds and bats eat pests of cocoa? And this is an absolutely breathtaking wattle-eye. This is a family that's only found in Africa, and they have this amazing piece of sort of colored flesh around their eye, which was the same species as the bird that I flashed initially and is in our logo, a different species, same family. So with DNA metabarcoding, we can also study this component of the ecosystem. So in this case, we caught thousands of birds and bats across many different cocoa farms, collected their feces, and then we sequenced that to tell what they're eating. And so not only can we create these food webs, and the food web is really complicated. This is one farm during one visit at one season, and even simplified version of that. But we can also tell which birds and bats are eating the pests of cocoa. There's one main cocoa pest that's thought to be responsible for millions and millions and millions of dollars worth of damage annually. It's called the brown capsid, Salburgellus singularis. And there was no DNA barcode for it. We developed it, and then we ran this technique. There it is right there. It's a true bug or a hemipteran, and we found 6 species of bats and 12 species of birds so far, including this amazing pygmy kingfisher here, that are eating the primary cocoa pest in Africa. So they're clearly doing some kind of ecosystem service. Then we try to quantify that. Now that's hard, and anytime you try to work in a manipulative experiment in nature, it's really, really tough. So credit to my grad students and sort of technicians and collaborators worked super hard on this to ask the question of whether birds and bats save farmers money. So to do this, cleverly, they designed this cool apparatus, which is basically a giant bamboo structure cage, if you will, around cocoa trees. And that basically excluded the birds and bats from coming in and eating the pests off of those trees. We repeated this for like a year through a whole cocoa season in a whole bunch of different farms. And we found the strongest results in the sunniest farms. So 4 times more pods on the control trees that had the birds and bats. So in other words, when you don't have birds and bats eating the pests, i.e. you put up this netting, you lose $800 per hectare per year in savings. And most of these farmers have like 2 or 3 hectares, something like this, and live well below the poverty line. So this is an enormous resource for them that the birds and bats are basically providing for free. So this is a really cool finding, and having this dollar sign, I think, is a useful sort of tool for making change on the ground. And it certainly gets the attention of farmers and hopefully politicians and the people that make these kind of decisions at the national level as well. Now, really cool bonus result here that we did not even expect to find or even think to look for at the beginning was that a whole bunch of different species, I'm just showing 3 here, are eating Anopheles mosquitoes. Now, if you know anything about Anopheles mosquitoes, this is the genus that causes human malaria. And globally, every year there's like 200 million cases of malaria, which causes enormous amount of suffering, like 600,000 deaths each year. And most of this is in Africa, and most is African children. So potentially, these animals are providing this other kind of ecosystem service in which they're increasing the health and livelihood and quality of life of these farmers and rural people everywhere. These are preliminary data, and I definitely want to take this further. We need to develop a DNA primer that looks at which species of Anopheles it is to confirm this, but this is, I think, really cool sort of preliminary evidence that birds and bats are providing this service. And then to basically take these findings back to farmers, Dr. Melanie Chambo through the Waterloo Foundation has been working with farmers really directly. She's reached now 600 farmers in 22 villages, and then she's going to work through this year as well to continue doing workshops. Just got back from one last week. So she's doing the really important task of then sharing all this information with the farmers, helping them to understand what are the beneficial birds and bats and insects, and how to manage their farms to promote these animals, to promote a more sustainable path forward. This is, I think, a part that's so rarely done in ecological studies, the sort of impact part, to actually making the change on the ground. And she's been surveying them sort of before and after, and is finding a huge change in their attitudes towards how beneficial these animals are. So for families and farmers like a Soma Christian, the idea is that they can then use these techniques to apply these win-win solutions. So manage their farms in ways that not only increase their yield and their quality of life, their incomes, but also protect biodiversity. So just to wrap things up here and give you some take-home messages before I take some questions, just like to share these lovely bat species. This is Rhinolophus alcyone. You can tell it has this incredible nose leaf, which actually emits the sound through its nose, and this complex feature has been evolved to emit the sounds, and when they hear it, bounce off things and hear it, basically have their own built-in sonar. This is Hippocedaris ruber, another lovely echolocating insectivorous bat. Both of these eat Anopheles mosquitoes and cocoa pests. And Diaphorophyia castanea, one of these wattle-eye species that has the lovely sort of fleshy part on its eye. As you can tell, I can look at pictures of animals all day and talk about them, but back to the research, wrapping things up. So I hopefully have convinced you, at least in part, that insectivorous birds worldwide, pantropically, are excellent indicators of rainforest ecosystem health. Some of these really specialized ant-following birds and rainforest specialists are truly the canaries in the coal mine. So cocoa is really quite diverse in terms of bird life and other biodiversity, but it is not a substitute for primary forest. It still lacks those specialist species, the ant followers, the specialized forest insectivores, and that to really have the full complement of African fauna and a fully functioning ecosystem, you need to have big chunks of primary forest. So that should really be a priority going forward. So birds and bats and insects clearly consume cocoa pests, and they pollinate cocoa. This saves farmers money, and this can create these wonderful win-win scenarios that we're shooting for, that are both biodiverse and create stable livelihoods for farmers. And finally, I think it's important to stress that now is absolutely the critical moment for conservation in sub-Saharan Africa. The human population is going to quadruple by the end of this century. Demand from the developed world and a growing middle class in China and in India are creating huge demand for commodity crops like chocolate, like oil palm, like cashew, like coffee. And this is driving large-scale change in tropical rainforests where things grow really well. So it is absolutely our responsibility to work with local Africans to train the very hungry and talented young African biologists and conservationists to protect their natural resources and become the sustainable stewards for biodiversity and tropical rainforest conservation. Thank you so much to all of you for listening, and thank you so much to all my funders and grad students and technicians for all your help with this.
Oh, thanks very much. That was fantastic information. So let me start sending questions your way. So the first one is, what are the biggest challenges in valuing ecosystem services on cacao farms?
Oh, so many challenges. It's a good question, and it's a difficult one to answer. I think the biggest challenge for me is the one I think I mentioned in the talk, is that basically in the lab, it's really easy to manipulate things. You know, you grow your Drosophila, fruit flies, and you breed them the way you want and you manipulate their little habitats inside the little test tube. But in the field, especially in tropical rainforests, it's a total mess. The ecosystem is unfathomably complex, and manipulating that ecosystem such that you can quantify it is really hard. So we've come up, well, it wasn't an original idea, of course, an exclusion experiment where we cover up the cocoa, but that's one way to go forward, but it's not you know, the be all end all. It's sort of one option. And I think coming up with, so the short answer, I guess, is coming up with creative solutions to do experimental studies in the field. I think that's the biggest limitation. And conservation and ecology are poorly funded. So we don't have tons of resources to, like the medical sciences, to dive into this, even though conservation biology is inherently a crisis discipline where we really need the resources and we need them right now. So that's really the big challenge. If we had a ton of money and resources to pour into some of these experiments, I think that would really help quantifying this, putting numbers, dollar signs on these.
Well, thanks. So the next question is, what are some possible ways that farmers can diversify their farms to attract more birds and bats?
Oh, that's good. That's a good one. Planting native trees is big. In Cameroon, this is kind of takes care of itself because the system usually works where farmers start with tropical rainforest and then they thin it out a little bit and put the cocoa underneath and slowly cut the trees. That's kind of the best way forward because the ecosystem is already kind of there and the native trees are in place. So I think I mentioned Melanie, who is just here in the green shirt. So she's received a grant to study the trees of the native trees that the birds prefer. So she's basically following them around and is trying to figure out which trees they like and they need, so that we can sort of match up the ones that eat the pests with the trees that the birds like, and then make those specific recommendations to farmers. What we suspect is that ficus, you know, figs, are going to be one of the main players there. They not only produce a ton of little figs, but they also attract huge numbers of insects. So that's sort of my short answer, but that's the direction we're going with that.
You've got a student from Brandeis who's working on regenerative agriculture in Puerto Rico, and she wanted to know what caused you to focus on cacao to begin with.
That's a good question with a very well-defined answer for once. My girlfriend at the time, now wife, moved to Glasgow in Scotland, and my postdoc was coming to an end at the Smithsonian, and I had to figure out a way where I could study tropical rainforest in Scotland with and work on birds and bats and conservation. And so the most obvious way to do that was to write a ton of proposals to get somebody in the Scottish or European government to pay me to work on cacao. And cacao is super poorly known, but it has all this enormous potential. About 75% of it is grown in Africa, and the fact that it's grown in the shade, that was really appealing to me. I didn't want to work in oil palm, for example, because it's so, don't quote me on this, and it's kind of the ecological equivalent of a Walmart parking lot. You know, I thought cocoa has so much more potential because it's grown in the shade.
Oh, that's a good story. I like it.
It worked out.
Is it the case that driver ants are more general in their habitat use than your understory birds? And if that's the case, when the ants leave the forest, can the birds follow?
That's a really good question. I think it's complicated. A guy named Lee Harper in the Amazon did an experiment with the sort of ecological equivalent, the army ant, where he painstakingly captured a whole swarm of these things when they were like in their bivouac. They're like this big ball of ants, and he put it in a bucket. I can't imagine the pain that he went through to do this. And then he took it into a forest fragment where there weren't any ants. And then, yeah, he didn't publish the study. I don't know why, because it's amazing. It's like a legendary study. But apparently the birds came back. So at least in the Amazon, in the Afrotropics, we really have no idea. But the strategy they seem to take is basically bombing around the forest floor to look for swarming army ants. The army ants are like cyclical and somewhat nomadic, and they're hard to track. So they just kind of bomb around and search for the ants. So they're really dependent. The ant is like what's driving, if you will, the system, and the ants are following them around.
Oh, well, that's now I want to read the bucket study. So another question is if you paid any attention to the impact on cacao cultivation in the wake of disasters. So when disasters hit, how much does it interfere with cacao production and the wildlife, especially when wildlife numbers are decimated and you don't have the control, the ecological controls?
I'm not sure if I understand the question.
The economic benefits, do they disappear?
I'm not sure if I'm following. What's the disaster part?
Well, I presume there are disasters there. So the example from the person asking was hurricanes hitting in Puerto Rico. I presume West Africa has its fair share of natural disasters.
So I guess they're asking if disasters affect cocoa production?
Well, if it affects cocoa indirectly through its effects on wildlife populations.
I have never thought of that, but probably the answer is probably yes. And I would wager to guess this is completely unknown, certainly in Africa. But if you'd like to do a PhD on that topic, send me an email. And likewise, if anybody wants to talk with me about any of this stuff going forward, please don't hesitate to reach out. I think I put my email on there somewhere, or maybe not. LukeLPowell@gmail.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I have a couple of questions actually. So the first one is, so you showed, well, by the way, thank you for this wonderfully complex talk. So I'm still thinking about what you showed about the bats and the birds reducing the insect populations, the pests. And I was wondering if you also saw any impacts on disease incidence. Because some insects are vector for pathogens, did you also see that the pathogen loading in cacao plants was reduced? Or maybe you didn't look at that, but I was curious about that. And my second question is more about the interaction with the farmers. Can you talk a little bit about how you convince them of your findings, and whether there was any pushback from them about implementing those practices in their farms?
Okay, so I'll tackle the first question first. So mealybugs. And I mentioned mealybugs because they are probably a vector for the main cocoa disease, which is a fungus. So I don't know whether this is happening, but my speculation is, and I would love to follow up and study, is that it's this really complex and interesting system where mealybugs walk around and kind of in these little groups. It's like this little puff of popcorn, basically, a tiny little puff of popcorn. And they're tended to by ants. They have this mutualistic relationship where the ants basically farm them, and they drink the honeydew that the mealybugs extrude, because they have their like mouth parts inside of the cocoa pods in the plant. And they get protection from the ants in exchange. It's a really interesting system. So I suspect that when you have birds and bats in the system, that they disrupt this ecological interaction, either by reducing the number of ants, which reduces the mealybugs, and then reduces the spread of the fungus. This is my sort of like pet theory on this one. I have no idea if it's true. And I think I'd love to work with a mycologist to study how the fungus spreads around. It's a really cool system, and there's really interesting sort of applications of this, because you can sort of manage the system in different ways, where you put the old cocoa pods in a certain and throw them away, or do you burn them, to prevent the spread of the fungus. This is all really poorly known, especially in Africa. I think it's better in Indonesia and the neotropics. And I think your second question was related to farmers, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you wanted to know how we actually get the information to them, basically.
How you get the information to them in a effective manner so that they trust the information, or whether they trust the information, really.
Yeah, it's a good question. So Melanie has been doing all of this work remotely from me, because we got the grant like right when the pandemic started. And so I'm hearing all this secondhand, unfortunately, but it sounds like she's doing a really wonderful job. And it does all start with trust. So she repeatedly goes to the communities again and again and again. Much like meeting with a colleague, buying them lunch goes a long way. So she basically spends the whole day with them in a small group, and buys them lunch. They all sort of have this interaction, and she gives a presentation, and then they pepper her with questions about how to manage their farm, and which trees to plant, and how much to trim, and what to do with the discarded cocoa husks so they don't get the cocoa rot. They keep coming back. She definitely seems to be building a relationship of trust with the farmers, and I'm really proud of the work that she's been doing there.
Thank you.
So I think we're wrapped up, are we? Thanks very much. That was fabulous information, and we'll definitely follow up with you on some of this stuff.
Thanks so much, Dr. Reed. It's been a real pleasure. And thank you, Sarah, for organizing, and to all the students and everyone listening. I really appreciate your time.